Thank you everyone for joining us today. This seminar workshop presentation has the very ambitious title of "What would the future of learning for creativity, innovation, entrepreneurship look like?" And it's actually the outcome, what we're presenting of our project called Erasmus project called Vision, envisioning the future of learning for creativity, innovation, entrepreneurship. So, and it's a workshop that is collaboration between several universities, academic institutions like EMUNI, the coordinator, ESADE, RMIT, but also we have organizations that are networks like ISPIM, but also enterprises and big companies like De Gruyter, Lufthansa, and TÜV Nord. So we have a nice mix of collaborators for this project, and there's a big team behind making Vision project happen. Today you'll see me and Olga will be at the spotlight, but behind this work you see many names that many of you might recognize, but we wanted to kind of acknowledge that this is not a two-person kind of result, but it's a result of collaboration, and it's a collaboration between these organizations that I presented, but it's also the result of the many conversations with stakeholders around the world. So just a very brief overview of what our methodology, what we did is we've interviewed around 150 people around the world, and then we had several workshops with a selected group of them, internal workshops between the team, but also external workshops, where we started kind of consolidating and synthesizing their insights. And what we asked people in the interviews is, in a nutshell, how do you see the future of learning for creativity, innovation, entrepreneurship in general, specifically, but also for education in general. So we spend a lot of time analyzing, restructuring our results, talking to each other, debating, and then the final result is what we are presenting today, which is the Vision book. Olga, I'll pass it on to you. I think we're missing the image of the book, no?
No, it's intentional. It's coming up later.
Oh, okay, sorry. Sorry. So please go ahead.
No worries, and thank you, Kyriaki, and thanks for everyone who joined us. This is just a slide where we wanted to outline somehow this design thinking and foresight methodology that we use to co-design, let's say, the output of this project, which will be an open access book. And the workshop today somehow is to present you, let's say, the current status of this book, the things that we came up with, and also to get your feedback. So it's still a work in progress, almost in there, but we feel like this is just the beginning of what the future of teaching and learning for creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship is. So we feel like it's just the beginning of the dialogue, and we want you all to be part of that dialogue in the future in many different ways. And so, as Kyriaki mentioned before, so we've done a series of internal and external workshops and interviews, and also collected different types of feedback from different stakeholders to identify somehow what are these trends and challenges that we face in the future of teaching and coaching for innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship. All these workshops that Kyriaki outlined before kind of served to outline, to consolidate what are the main elements that we see transforming within the higher educational space. And that led us somehow to identify these pillars of learning, the learning elements that we are going to present to you today, and somehow the shifts. So what is shifting? How is it going to go forward? And all of that led to an open access book that we're currently finalizing, and we'll be very happy to share with you later this year. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah, so basically this is exactly the image that Kyriaki wanted to show you before. So this is just the cover. So we are somehow the co-authors of the book, but this book, as Kyriaki mentioned as well, is a collaborative endeavor of all the people who were interviewed during the project, and also all the project partners, of course. And actually some of them are here in the room and will also be happy to answer your questions, or perhaps feel free to comment on any of the content that we are presenting today. And so the goal somehow for our goal is to go somehow for these main elements that we have in this open access book and get your feedback, as I mentioned before. So somehow the book is structured in 3 different parts. So first, we will talk about these trends that we've identified. So what are the shifts in the learning landscape? What are the elements that we've identified across these different groups of stakeholders that somehow appeared important to them? And some of them are already shifted, some of them are shifting, and some of them are need to be started, and different stakeholders are positioned in a different way across these different shifts. And so the idea for us is to create awareness in what are the elements of the educational space that should evolve. So we'll go through this part in the first part of the workshop, and then we also have around 15 different case studies. So we call them snapshots because they're very short that we've collected in this book, and we are going to just show you the principles behind that, and also get some of your examples as well, maybe the cases that you're working on. And then the part 3 somehow is more, so with all of that, the so what part. So how do we then start thinking about these future ready learning landscapes? How we in our own specific organizations can think about what are the critical elements that need to be shifted, how to maybe start the discussion around them. So it is important to maybe outline, we do not present this book as a toolkit. Sorry, it's actually more kind of a guiding book. So it will not give you the how-to strategy in a very specific way, but more indicate the way forward in a general way in different forums. So if we go to the next slide, we'll start with basically presenting this learning landscape, these learning elements that we've identified through the book. And we kind of describe what is shifting between them. So if I show you this, I think any educational institution will have them in practice. So nothing new in there. So what we are presenting with this slide, that we've structured the book and all the elements that we're discussing across different elements. Together, we've identified 12 of them, and we've structured them across first pillars of learning. And by pillars of learning, I mean, well, any type of learning activity obviously centered towards students. We need teachers, coaches. It does have to have a certain form of a space, and we'll discuss how these things are changing, and also knowledge or subject matter that is out there. So these are the 4 pillars of learning that we're going to quickly outline. Learning journey, obviously. So what is the process of learning? Which type of styles of learning we are going to use? Which type of materials need to be present for you to, let's say, accommodate any type of learning activity? And obviously with digitalization and digital transformation of many organizations today, digital technology is playing an important role in learning. And obviously COVID-19 has emphasized that a lot in many traditional spaces. So what is the role of technology, and how is it changing as well? And then finally, learning results are obviously an important part as well. So how do we go about evaluations in the future? What are the outcomes, outputs of learning? What is the impact somehow? So we'll quickly now introduce all these shifts, and again, feel free to use chat or raise your hand so we can have this opportunity to discuss the shifts with you and see what you think and how you feel about them as well. Next slide. Kyriaki, the floor is yours.
Yes, so I just realized that I was muted. So the pillars of learning, as Olga said, you know, any learning has four key elements, which is the educator, the learner in a way. They have to meet somewhere, so they have the space, and then the subject of the exchange, the knowledge. And so the way that we started thinking, what we started doing is identifying the different trends and the changes that are already happening, and they are more likely to be more relevant in the future. So what one of the top things that we identified is that the student is the image of the student being kind of sitting in the classroom, passive, listening to a teacher that is in the front, who has kind of the control, and everyone is the attention is, he's at the spotlight of learning, is changing towards the student becoming more active in their learning journey. So that means, for example, that students become they become almost like agents themselves. So they generate and they learn how to learn. They synthesize information. They are the center of learning. And as we will explain later, they themselves have the responsibility of bringing in the material in the classroom to tackle to address the subject of knowledge, which is kind of co-created between the teacher and the student. And as the role of the student is changing, the role of the teacher as well. So as the student becomes more active in their learning, then the teacher or the educator is no longer kind of responsible or the one that is completely in control of the classroom and no longer lecturing, but then they become they work side by side with the students in certain cases. They're coaches, curators, and learning designers. And what we mean by that is that their role in this kind of new space of learning is that they design the learning experience, and they're providing the students the tools and the guidance they need to navigate the space, rather than telling them, you know, this is the textbook you need, and this is all the information you need. So a curator, for example, what it means again is the educator selects and synthesize different information and provides the tools to the learners to learn by doing themselves, and they try to figure out a way to design better educational experiences. And then as these roles changes as well, then the space, the traditional learning environment, which is classrooms and lecture halls, you know, whereby again the student is sitting there and the teacher is kind of transferring the information, downloading information. This new environment requires students and more flexible learning environment. So the students are able to switch the furniture around, for example, so that they can work in teams. The teacher can sit next to them side by side and act as coaches. But also importantly is that the space for learning is no longer kind of limited to the traditional academic spaces, even if they're flexible. There are a lot of learning that we realize now is shifting more towards the real world. So students are encouraged to do field visits and learn by visiting specific places where they can gain first-hand information. They're encouraged to interview people Even there's like this new methodology of, or it's an old methodology actually from the ancient Greek style of learning, which is like you go for walks and you start working with students in nature and talk about and observe, and as a way of learning.
And the final one is basically these changes with students. Like the focus on students, different types of teaching styles, spaces is obviously reflected on the disciplines as well, on the subject matter, the way we called it. And of course, education will still contain different disciplines, and we do not want to say that disciplines are irrelated anymore, but we see this shift towards more multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, problem and challenge-based learning. So I think it's not new to anyone in this audience, but we see more and more that the learning is closely related to real-world context and contemporary issues. Sustainable development goals obviously is one of the frameworks that is used quite a lot to center educational practices. So we see that the universities are kind of pushed to actually relate to sustainable development goals even more, and see how they can embed it both their research capacity, but even more in terms of their learning structures. I mean, many of you, I would imagine, have dealt already with challenge-based learning or problem-based learning activities at the level of the courses, curriculums, or even the university itself, involving only students, are also trying to deal with industry itself. So we do see this big shift towards dealing with big questions. One of the schools that we interviewed were basically saying that we are actually moving towards, we don't want to focus on simple challenges anymore, but we need to put students towards big questions and big challenges of the society, and make them reflect on what's going on and how they can actually use their learning to the advantage of solving, or at least thinking about solving some of these challenges. And to reflect that, obviously problem and challenge-based learning appear as most kind of prevalent methods. And what we see a lot, that there is more and more this focus on experience. Many of you will be familiar with experiential learning techniques. So how do you design an experience that will take into account this multidisciplinary learning and allow students to navigate through these different processes in an easier way? And that is obviously reflected by a learning journey in the second part of the book, where we talk about this. So what and how processes of organizing this shift towards these different pillars in that particular context. And yeah, so basically the first part, thanks for anticipating the movement of the slides. So the first part of that is the style activity. In the past, obviously, education was already happening in the groups. We are not saying that it's a general move from individual to team-based and collaborative. What is different is that now these team-based and collaborative activities do not negate the individual itself. So we're actually seeing the combination of seeing individuals as specific in different groups, but also allowing them to collaborate at the same time. And these shifts we see from spaces, as was mentioned before, different forms of collaboration between different students, interdisciplinary groups created across different curriculums as well. And obviously the technology and different infrastructures that we use have to reflect that. So how do we ensure that teams are working collectively, but also trying to reflect on what they learn as a team, what are the challenges and what are the different ways to come up with efficient ways of working together, especially in the online environments. And if we go to the next slide, please. So here we have processes as well. So processes are becoming much more experimental, much more iterative. So many different curriculums, not even in relation to creativity, innovation, and in entrepreneurship, somehow they're actually embedding design thinking, active-based learning, agile learning, lean startup in their processes to actually make students to reflect on what they learn, how they navigate through these different shifts, and how they can be future ready. And the main reason for that is that we can't just design specific content-based courses anymore. We actually need to use content in order to teach students, like many of you have seen the reports on soft-based skills, critical thinking, other elements that have to be integrated into the learning practices. And for us to be future ready, we need somehow to learn these creative ways of critical thinking, trying to explore in uncertainty, navigating the unknown landscapes, and different things related to that. And this is somehow related to process activities that we're presenting here. And then finally, obviously, we mentioned digital technologies here. And technology obviously is an enabler. It has always been an enabler to educational practices. What we see here quite a lot is that it's not one directional anymore. So we can't design learning spaces where a student passively stays in front of the screen. Well, let's avoid what we are doing right now, where we basically communicate information to you in a direct way, but you do not have the capacity to react. I mean, it's limited to a chat or raise button function. So we see this has already been obsolete in many different places, and we try to move it towards more interaction, more immersive learning. And we need to see how this immersive learning can be then reflected. So from one side, we see it having many more flexibilities and connections, but we also need to be very careful by designing those interactive ways of learning, so we don't overwhelm students with too many options and too many possibilities. Like I've seen many of us, we've seen consequences of having too much of screen time lately, Zoom fatigue or digital overload, information overload. So how do we design then a learning experience that actually integrate the technology in a natural way?
And in addition to kind of digital technologies shifting, what we also see, and this image doesn't quite capture what we're going to revise it for the book, but also the physical material that is being used today is changing. So in a lot of classrooms still today, what you expect to use is like blackboards or whiteboards with textbooks and notebooks. This have been kind of the main physical material that you expect in the classrooms, but increasingly, and especially in classrooms where there's for creativity innovation courses, what you see is that there's a lot more physical material. There's Post-its, for example. There's different kind of materials that you can start doing like rough prototyping with. So you're returning to kind of using more arts and crafts again, which disappear. You know, the stuff that you see, for example, in kindergartens are coming back to the classroom that disappear for like 12 years. And now with more emphasis on creativity, innovation. And I think, and we think that this is a trend that continues, that you also see more, not only in specifically kind of innovation courses, but I think in more environments, more crafts and arts are being used. So, and then finally, kind of the last group of trends or elements that we think they're shifting, and this is perhaps the most kind of less obvious. And what Olga said is that in many cases, a lot of the shifts that we've described so far, people are already experimenting, and they are there's a lot of successful kind of examples of courses where they implement all 8 of them, and you probably yourselves, many of you are experimenting with. But what we find less kind of clear is a correlation between what the processes and the changes in roles with what you expect to have at the end of these experiences. So the outputs, for example, so you cannot have a course that is that aims to make enhance skills or competencies of creativity innovation, and at the end you expect a paper or you give an exam. What we sees that now you need to have outputs that reflect the doing and making, such as, you know, prototypes and so forth. I think we're running out of time, so I'm going to go a little bit faster. And then outcomes. Outcomes, I think it's Olga will jump in now.
No, it's still you.
The evaluation. Yeah, so then let me just see. Okay. So, so again, it's what you would expect to have students gain at the end of a standard course is knowledge that is very that one can probably get by just reading a textbook on the subject. The knowledge that the students will receive at the end of a kind of what we consider to be examples or learning journeys that are future ready, are more kind of, in addition to knowledge that is more personalized and based on the students' desires and the students' way of planning their course. There's also a lot of skills and attributes. And then naturally, when you evaluate the course, the evaluation of the course also has to change a lot. And so how do you evaluate the success of a course where the students are encouraged to fail along the way? So you can no longer have a midterm exam that is 50% of the grade, for example, in a challenge-driven course, because in a way, by design, the students should be okay to fail, and they're encouraged to fail in the middle of the course. And this is something that we are grappling with, and I think there's going to be probably an academic paper coming after this book, whereby we are trying to see kind of really deep dive into what would a multi-dimensional kind of way of evaluating the learner would be, where it's not only about the knowledge itself, but also about the skills and competencies that they gain. So how do you use the knowledge, for example, that we teach, and also how can we evaluate whether they become better citizens by taking our course, or that they gain some sorts of values and attitudes like empathy and responsibility or sustainability, you know, all these values that a lot of this challenge based learning that aims to tackle grand societal challenges kind of aims to achieve. And then finally, you know, how do we ensure that students reflect, know how to reflect and adapt, how to learn basically, how they learn how to learn. And then the final hardest thing to evaluate, Olga, back to you.
Sorry. And basically, yeah, and all of that is related to impact. So we did talk about the subject matter that is changing, and basically the relation to these challenges and sustainable development goals. So we also see that it has to be reflected not only at the research level. So there are lots of discussions, obviously, on the research impact within the higher educational institutions, but what is impact of our learning, how to measure it? And we see that this impact should not be just institutional anymore or individual for different students, but how do we integrate it in a more societal level? In a way, we do not claim that this book provides all the answers. It somehow more asks of the questions to some extent, but we do see that many institutions are trying to move towards more societal impact of learning and try to see, okay, how can we reflect that? How do we translate it in practice? And how do we make even students at the individual level reflect on which type of impact they can generate, both through their courses by participating, for instance, in challenge-based learning activities, but also beyond that, how do we collect this type of information and then bring it back to different institutions? So this is obviously an important and very interesting area. And so across these three different types of learning, three different categories of the learning landscape. So we have 12 different shifts that we've identified. We do not claim that this is comprehensive. There might be other elements. For instance, one of them that we deliberately did not treat in this book is business models of the education, something that is changing as well. We left it out. There might be other elements as well, like standardization of learning, for example, is not something that we looked into as well. But what we can do now, before we move to examples or the how-to, maybe we can pause for your comments or questions. And I know that there are a few already in the chat.
I will stop sharing my screen so people can see maybe each other a little bit better. Yeah. But I mean, there's some really excellent points that have been put in the chat. Can I invite, I think it was Benoit and Urs to just voice them aloud.
Thank you for the invitation to this session. Very interesting reflections. So the questions I put on the chat is also to hear your perspective on the evolution regarding the contents. What are the questions we should discuss with students, the challenges, the themes? There's a tension of now kind of scope and innovation related in our sense, or we can extend to kind of skills and relevant issues like ethics, for example, which could be very relevant, but then how far do you go? That's one thing. And the other one is the tension between let's say the pool. Students want to hear about the latest gadget, the latest fad, the latest canvas, the latest concepts. And at the same time, the science push, which is what is it actually we actually know, which is not just something somebody wrote a book about. And so the tension between the science base and the market pull for me is also we want to do something which feels up to date and relevant, but at the same time we want to share knowledge which is somewhat validated. So I want to hear your perspective on that, the scope and the kind of fad versus science.
Okay, I can start. These are the two excellent comments, and obviously a lot is changing, and maybe just a reflection first on the second part, so the science-based versus market pull. So we see that it is definitely a challenge, and I think it's related to content as well. How do you then structure your courses? Should it be market-driven, seeing what are the trends that are out there, or shall we bring the more recent advances from science and actually translate them into practice? Maybe two things that stand out, at least from our data sample. The first one, it is impossible to design a content today that you can use over and over. So the content will be shifting all the time. And basically that's why I think it's reflected now in this focus on skills. So what are we actually trying to translate? What are these learning objectives within each course that can be content specific, discipline specific, but also more reflecting the skills that we need to accomplish within each specific course? And the content part between market pull and science-based push, somehow it's reflected, at least in a few cases that I was involved in this introduction of learning designers. So what we see more and more, and it can be learning designers or teachers themselves, so we see more and more that the curriculum is designed by, for instance, people. I mean, there are, at least in Australia, you have now learning designers that actually design curriculum and invite then academics and industry every year to contribute with their expertise. So somehow you combine this market pull with science push by actually bringing experts to the class. And I mean, academics might actually play that role as well, but we see this shift being more and more like happening in some places by introducing additional types of stakeholders in the learning space.
Can I challenge you a bit? You say it's changing all the time. I think that the formats and the wordings and maybe the technological examples are changing. But if you go back to the book of Besant of 20 years ago, 80% of what's in there is useful for students today. So why would you say it's changing all the time?
No, I meant the content itself. So the examples that you would introduce. So okay. Yeah, it's basically you would structure the learning outcomes and learning objectives in the similar way, but you will have to adjust basically the examples that you bring to the realities of science-based perspective and the market pool. Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know, Kyriaki, would you like to add anything to that?
It relates, I mean, to some of the comments that Benoit said, but also I think Bernadette, about, you know, the effort that goes into designing courses like this, that sometimes kind of push against established, not only kind of established roles, like the teacher becoming a coach and so forth, but also she points out timeframes. So the semester or 3-month time frame. And it's true, usually a lot of these courses would need a lot more time. I mean, I have been in charge of a 12 credit course that is challenge-based course, challenge-driven course, kind of that starts with SDGs and brings together designers and engineers and MBA students. And you always run out of time. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is how do you put these different experiences side by side, so that then you still respect somehow the time frames, but then after you have continuation. But it's a good point that the classic semesters, and we have to admit that we didn't think of the time frame as much. Are you okay? Yeah. Bernadine, do you want to add anything to your comment?
Yeah, thank you so much for referring to my question. Yeah, I was just wondering, like, in the moment where you really try to stay within this learning process as a part of reality or a group process, I'm always experiencing that if you cut processes, that the learning is not completed. Because currently we are used to half a year structures, and then you have the exam and this is over. And I'm wondering how sustainable this approach is in this field of actually having a challenge that you want to tackle, and probably takes a year or probably takes 2. And I think currently our higher educational programs, they are not seen in this larger framework, but we have very much fragmented learning in a way that is not covering up with this great switches from traditional learning to future learning. And I'm really wondering how practically this change will happen, and if it goes along with a more holistic time-wise change.
No, I mean, I completely agree with that, and we do see it as a main challenge. Actually, these time frames of different semesters, they can be very fragmented, and I mean, we can imagine many different ways of doing so, right? Like trying to collect this societal impact later on once the students finish, to see how they're actually using the results of these learning practices. In some other cases, but I think I've seen only one of them, these challenges actually run across the master program. For instance, the students start at the beginning, they have a challenge that is identified perhaps in collaboration with industry, and they would go through all the, let's say, stages of exploring that problem across 2 years. So each semester they would tackle like different levels of maturity of this specific challenge. For instance, they would start with understanding what's happening there, state of the art, trying to identify and scope the problem in the first semester. The second one, they will start to design their approach to solve those challenges. The third one, they will, start with testing some of the hypotheses. And then the final one, they would refine and actually produce a prototype. So you can scale the times and experiment with that. But obviously you would need somehow to embed this challenge across the program and connect different courses towards that. So it requires a lot of rethinking and rebuilding at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, and linked to kind of the question that Urs has put forward is, what are the more kind of contextual factors or characteristics that affect how these shifts exactly are enacted? And he puts the point of class sizes, and this is another kind of red flag in a way of these shifts, is that they the kinds of learning experiences we are talking about and we see, they're usually not they're smaller, let's say, in size. Students work together in groups of 6 to 8, and because you require a lot of coaches as well, so I've seen examples like in technical universities like Eindhoven, for example, where they have a first-year course for 400 students that is challenge-based. But in my case, I only have 45 students, and it's very challenging. So I think you can do it in different, so class size matters, but I feel like if you have the resources and you can have a lot of kind of assistants or coaches, you can run them in parallel. But a big idea, I mean, context absolutely matters in the success of the stories, and context and financial infrastructures are a key. Even in what we are talking about, having flexible spaces, for example, we see them taking place in universities that have the resources to change. For example, the library spaces now, they're being transformed into kind of like working spaces, shared working spaces, and that's a shift that can be handled differently depending on the context and the infrastructures that are in place. Any other questions, Olga, that you see?
Not sure, but yeah, maybe just another reflection that I had on that is basically we also see students in terms of these time frames and spaces actually constructing their degrees in a more life learning perspective. And I think Rajneesh just commented on that. And it made me think about my own students in Australia, where they basically decide when and how they want to structure their semesters. So they could start, I don't know, in 2018, their MBA program, and they will finish it in, they decide actually how many courses they want to take per semester, when, and whether they want to take a break to go back to full-time working and then come back and learn something else. So you can actually stretch and design those that will actually allow you to, let's say, prioritize your own learning objectives. So we see that, yes, there are general shifts, but they also need to reflect the aptitudes and the preferences of each and different learner. And then I think Urs also made a comment on that it's very, very hard to organize group work online. I completely agree. I mean, for some people it does work, for many others it does not. It is very hard, and we are not saying that digital technology is actually going to replace the face-to-face education. We need to find optimal ways to actually combine both, and I still feel like we are really far from doing it in an optimal way in many situations. So I would love to hear if you actually, any of you, have good examples of how we can do it in practice. Yeah.
Any other comments? Anyone would like to just ask a question live? We read through your questions. I think more of them. I don't know if we addressed everything, but I think, yes, absolutely, about impact. There's a lot of work on, you know, in entrepreneurship about impact, social impact, that we are aware of and try to build some of our reflections on.
Yeah, feel free to jump in, or even anyone from the team, if you have additional examples, you're welcome to come in.
Peter, yeah, I'll stop sharing my screen again.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that a lot of the problems with trying to go down this path is people try and shoehorn the solutions into the ways they used to work. I think you have to let go of a lot of things to be able to move from all those things that we were doing to the new things. And that's easier said than done. There's a lot of institutional resistance and baggage to shifting to having, say, an entirely online class, which might meet when the students want it to meet rather than when the timetabling people want it to meet, or thinking about, okay, do we really need something like semesters at all? Can we continuously deliver stuff? But that we're quite well ingrained into thinking about courses last this long, that they come in these nice little blocks. And I think one of the biggest challenges is actually that both for lecturers and for students, the old-fashioned way is really quite easy. It's relatively low engagement. There's not much of a cognitive load in getting up and doing a lecture or sitting in a lecture, but all these other ways actually require you to be much more involved, and that is actually a lot more work. So I thoroughly support all the things you're saying we should be doing, and I'm looking forward to finding ways to overcome those hurdles.
Yeah.
But I think you're absolutely right. In a way, what we are talking about pushes against, all the walls, that have been built over the last century. But as Olga will kind of explain more details, there's little things that you can start inserting in your own initiatives that can help you become more more flexible, more agile, and ready for these trends that we are talking about.
Yeah, and maybe what we can do, let's start with the examples and come back to that later on. Yeah.
All right, so then we can continue. I think actually, Olga, yeah, you're next.
No worries. If you just can come back to the previous slide quickly. Yeah, the one after. Yeah, that's perfect. So yeah, basically this is the second part. And the idea here is, like, since we we've built this on so many different interviews and different cases that we've seen out there. So we felt it could be interesting to kind of provide snapshots of how different institutions are doing these things already, at least some of the cases that we've seen interesting. And obviously, we're not saying that all of them actually have shifts across 12 different elements. Some of them excel in some aspects, some of them didn't even start others yet. And so the idea is for you to also see, okay, where do I stand at my level as a lecturer from my curriculum, or at my level of the university, and how do I want to achieve those? And those snapshots are kind of the way we've structured them is basically we looked into both edtechs. So, I mean, all of you have seen that there are many, the landscape is actually changing quite a lot. Many actually decided to come back to Peter's point. It's like, I don't want to deal with the higher educational institutions. They're like not possible to change. So let's create something alternative outside of the current educational system. Or even let's create new educational forms, new universities from scratch, where we don't have to, again, deal with path dependencies. But many others are also trying to shift their traditional learning landscapes. So that's why what we've done in this part, we basically picked up 5 exemplary snapshots for edtechs, for higher educational institutions, and also for the corporate space, just to illustrate some examples of what we found interesting. And we will just quickly outline with Kyriaki 2 of them, but then happy to share all the rest, obviously. So the first one, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Minerva. But so Minerva is a US based school. Somehow it's a mixture between a higher educational space and NetTech. So it's a venture-backed Silicon Valley initiative founded by 2012 by Ben Nelson. And basically the idea is behind you have the science of learning approach, which comprises findings in a wide range of ideas, including, for instance, the study of memory, perception, comprehension, learning and reasoning. And they partnered with the Cal Graduate School to create this comprehensive approach for learning. And so what they try to do, they try to structure the curriculum across these, what they call habits of mind that are reflected and foundational concepts that are reflected across the learning. So students that come in, obviously they have some disciplines that they would study. All the lectures are actually online and they can follow them in their own time. And they only meet for group work together, both online and physical. So they do not have any physical space for education. They don't have any, let's say, physical infrastructure, but they meet every semester in a different place of the world, in a different country, where they would tackle specific problems in relation to that particular environment. For instance, the students I talked to, they were in San Francisco and they had to deal with the problem of waste. at that particular semester. And so they were all there living together, trying to tackle the challenges. The classes were online that they could follow. What was interesting is that every time for every type of activity, they had to reflect in the form of hashtags. What are the learnings? How do they, for instance, if you're dealing, I don't know, with the waste management and you're using certain analytical techniques of big data, they would add hashtag big data or hashtag emerging properties or multiple causes. So they needed, while submitting their work, to reflect through the entire curriculum, what are the connections between different disciplines and how they learn. And another interesting element, and I'll be done with that, is they don't have any kind of formal evaluations that is communicated to them in form of grades until the very end of their curriculum. So they need to reflect on the hashtags, they need to reflect on their learning, but the formal evaluation will only happen at the end. Of course, they do have lots of feedback and other elements. And what we try to do with these snapshots, we basically looked into our different elements of learning. If you go to the next slide, yeah, you're already there. And basically, so you can see our elements. And what we try to do, we try to represent those shifts somehow to see, okay, how would we position different cases across different times? And obviously, for instance, in Minerva, they say they're not teachers, they're coaches. Students are pretty much at the center. They're the ones who are driving the education. Subject matter is very interdisciplinary, learning styles, very iterative, aspects like that. So we use somehow this spider web to kind of help reflect where do we stand as an organization and where we want to go forward. So this is just one case. And I think the second one that we are presenting is Fusion Point. Kyriaki?
Yeah, and this is a case where I've been kind of personally involved. And it's an initiative that started basically from an attempt to put a course together. And it's a course that, so it's a course that that brought together a UPC, a polytechnic school, a design school, and a SADA, which is a business school, but also CERN. It was an idea from a group at CERN to start bringing students to see if they can find innovative ways to connect their technologies and infrastructures and research with the real world. So eventually this course developed into a formal partnership, and now there's other similar courses that are being delivered. But the idea is that we want to tackle real life challenges. I think since 2016-17, we actually take an SDG as our starting point to frame the challenge of the year around. This year is going to be climate action. I'm very excited about. And then the students work in teams, ideally with two different kind of two students per kind of expertise. And the way that the graphic is not quite right, but I think what this kind of experiment grapples with is all the challenges that I think have been raised by Peter and Benoit. Is we are kind of always dealing with the infrastructural, let's say, hurdles. Like at the beginning, we didn't know where to meet, for example, because there were only like a few classrooms that we could work for a course like challenge-based innovation. So eventually, actually, there was a space built that now is called Fusion Point, where we can move the furniture around and so forth. We're still struggling to figure out how to evaluate the students, what kind of deliverables we want to ask for them at the end of the course that reflect, the whole journey. How do we grade them? How to evaluate that they actually received the kinds of skills and competencies. But this is a challenge that is a very big challenge, evaluating and figuring out how you measure the impact of the course. It's also let's say a challenge for traditional courses as well, or learning experiences to an extent. So this is just another example that we use of showing that there are attempts out there that are grappling with all the shifts and trying to experiment and they're in the process of changing things. I mean, just to say another example is like teaching or figuring out how to not be lecturers anymore, but for traditional full-time professors to go to a classroom and be coaches. And that has been a really big challenge. And how do we give advice, but and stir the students in the right direction? So what we try to do, like at the end of this book, in a way, is synthesize all the trends that we saw, and the learnings from the case studies into kind of a step-by-step process where you can try to follow, and regardless of where you stand. So you can be a policymaker that wants to kind of look into the general, kind of get a general feeling about where things are, or if you're just planning a course and you want to see where your course is vis-a-vis these changes. And I think, Olga, now you can start from here, no? From this image, you can say a little bit more.
Yeah, yes, please. And thanks, Kyriakis. So yeah, the idea is not to provide you a hands-on guide on how to rebuild your educational space, but more to guide you a little bit on reflecting, okay, if we do think that these elements are interesting, these shifts can be valuable, so how can we use them to our own advantage? Like you've seen the cases of Minerva and Fusion Point, we have others, but all of us have our own educational environment. So how can we use the spider web somehow to just quickly position, okay, where do we stand? How do we want to go from there? What are the elements that we should focus on first? Because I'm quite sure that many of you will be already excelling in some of these shifts, and some others will be completely maybe unnoticed, like evaluations or other aspects. So what is it that you need to focus on first to basically shift your learning landscape, and how then you design it and start to reshape and reiterate? Because what we see as well is that we need to have this holistic view of these different elements, because often we would focus on one element, but then we forget that actually as soon as you change something, you kind of disbalance the whole ecosystem, and you need to kind of make sure that you kind of bring all the puzzles back together. And so that's why, for instance, you are working on challenge-based learning. So what about the evaluations, like Kyriaki mentioned before? You need to come back. And so what we try to do is kind of create this little, very easy guide to follow. I'm not going to go in detail through that, but we'll use it to also reflect maybe on your own learning environment right now. If we go to the next slide. So yeah, the first one, I mean, obviously from what we've presented before, very easily. So to think, okay, where do we stand as a different types of stakeholders within the educational environment? How you individually would actually reflect on, okay, where I would put myself from, I don't know, 0 to 5 in terms of, are we already student-centric or not yet? Are we already integrating interdisciplinary education or not really? Are we experimenting with different types of spaces that will be adjusted to different practices of learning? What are the styles that we're using? So if you can, I don't know, maybe we can do it all together right now to reflect on, I don't know if anyone wants to share on with what we've presented already across pillars of learning, learning journey, learning results. Do you guys think that you already nailed some parts of it? I think Peter mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that he already delivers everything online. I don't know, Peter, if he wants to jump in. Sorry to put you on the spot, but you have your video on.
Okay, yeah. So I launched a new master's program, the Master of Business Development, which is delivered entirely online, and is really centers on problems and challenges coming from the students. So most of the students are engaged in business development in some way or another, and they bring those problems into the classroom and they work on those problems. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's starting to work more than it doesn't work. And at the end of it, they do a large integrating project using agile techniques. And we're just working on how we span that over multiple periods of time. So if one set of students can't manage the whole project, it can carry on and be worked on by the next groups. But it's definitely work. It's definitely work, but once it's set up, it seems to work quite well by itself. Yeah, but it's a different sort of work.
That's a great example. And if you, and obviously you're already experimenting with styles, subject matters, and technologies in there. What about the learning results? Like, do you feel like that will require more work, or especially if we are talking about the societal impact of those things?
Because the students are typically working on issues they've brought to the classroom themselves. I say classroom, but have brought to work on. They tend to be very engaged in the task, and so yes, I'm sure it is more work for them, but it's work that they want to be doing rather than they feel obliged to be doing.
Yeah. Interesting. Thanks for sharing. Is there anyone else who wants to jump in? And it can be just one of the shifts or something else that you feel like you are actually doing in a great way, or maybe a challenge that you want to overcome. Feel free. Or a question that you have. Okay. Silence. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And
let's continue, and then maybe some questions will come up later.
And basically, so what we are trying to do in there. So first, you'll kind of try to individually see how do you position yourself across all the learning elements. But we also advise you in the previous one to actually go and talk to different stakeholders. Like, this is your perception, but how are your colleagues seeing it? Because you would see that maybe these little clouds that we see in the spider web can be completely different. And that can be a tool for you to communicate with your stakeholders to see, okay, are we actually having a common understanding of how our institution is positioned across these shifts or not? And then based on these evaluations and discussions with different groups of people that you'll have, I don't know, for instance, you're a lecturer, you want to embed the challenge-based learning in your curriculum, you will do the evaluation yourself, but then go and talk to, I don't know, the administrator of your college, or even talk to students or talk to industry and see whether they would actually see the value in that. And here, this is simplified for the purpose of the workshop, but the idea is also to say, okay, we will never be able to deal with all of them at the same time. So what are the free shifts or different options that you would find as the most important for you to focus on right now? And then how do you design the learning activities, the evaluation, and different parts? And we have a canvas to do that, to actually explore these options further. And once you've done it, if we go to a next slide, and then we can pause for questions. So what we try to see, okay, you have, for instance, 3 major options. Like, for instance, your top 3 priorities are the bigger parts of this square, so 1, 7, and 4. And you will say, and the other options that you find important, but perhaps secondary importance, you can actually use Tangram as an approach. We just use it as an analogy to say, okay, you've identified these priorities, but you can actually combine them in many different ways. So each of you, if we will give you these tangrams, you can actually design many different ways of doing these things. It can be a dog, a cat, and any other element. So you can assemble them in very creative ways. So it's not only the shifts that are important, but also the interdependency between them and how you come up with the whole picture, which brings us to our final comment that once you picked up something, you design the curriculum, you kind of come back, you need to re-equilibrate the entire ecosystem. So you need to make sure that everything is aligned. For instance, you've reflected on evaluation of the courses and not just on the purposes of challenge-based learning, or you properly embedded the students, or you thought about that the digital technologies that you are using are actually reflecting the learning purposes and not adding additional constraints. So this is just to create this awareness across these different things. And obviously it's more detailed. It helps you to kind of think about these things from different perspectives, but I don't want to go into more details here. And maybe we can pose for discussion and questions that you might have, or even your own, let's say, examples, if you would love to share. I mean, we would love to hear more from you.